It is then now my pleasure to welcome and introduce our colloquium speakers for this afternoon. We are really privileged that we have two of our colleagues from Michigan State University presenting some of their joint work today. First, we have Professor Betsy Sneller, who only recently joined the MSU faculty after completing her PhD at University of Pennsylvania, and then also um, spending some time as a postdoctoral researcher at Georgetown University. Professor Sneller is a sociolinguist. She studies sound change and in specific um, the role of individual members of speech communities in sound change. She also does work on how children acquire linguistic variation and sociolinguistic variation. Her research has appeared in some of the major journals of our field, such as Language Variation and Change and also Cognition. The second of our presenters this afternoon is Professor Suzanne Wagner, who has been on faculty at MSU since completing her PhD also at University of Pennsylvania in 2008. Professor Wagner is also a sociolinguist, and she focuses in her research on language change and the social meaning that speakers ascribe to language variation. Like Professor Sneller, Professor Wagner's research also looks at individuals and in how they agree with and diverge from the speech communities in which they participate. She's also widely published in some of the major journals such as Language and Society, American Speech, Language Variation and Change, and more. Professor Sneller and Wagner co-direct the Michigan State Sociolinguistics Lab, and today they will talk to us about a joint project coming out of their lab, focusing on how the disruption in regular face-to-face interaction caused by this COVID pandemic might be impacting language change, and also how that might be impacting the kinds of methodologies that we have to use to study language change and sociolinguistics. So with that, Betsy and Suzanne, thank you very much for spending this afternoon with us and sharing your research with us today. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for such a wonderful introduction and the important reminder that science matters, and we collectively as a body are doing good work. So I really appreciate that. Yes, so we are talking about a very new project that's currently underway called the MI Diaries project. The point of it is right there. We're trying to track language change during this pandemic. So brief roadmap about this talk today. We're going to start out by outlining two sociolinguistic theories that are hypothesized to rely on face-to-face interaction. A brief reminder of some ongoing language changes in Michigan that are perhaps particularly likely to be affected by social distancing. And then we'll talk about the mechanics of it all. So how do we do sociolinguistic fieldwork during a pandemic where you're not able to actually be face-to-face collecting sociolinguistic interviews? And then end up with where we're going next. And we are hoping to hear from many of you some ideas as well. But first, let's start with these sociolinguistic theories that rely on face-to-face interaction. And again, we're going to be focusing on two of them. The first is sociolinguistic development. So what I mean by that is how kids acquire sociolinguistic variation, and specifically during a period of language change in the broader community. So first, a giant step back and a quick reminder just so that we're all on the same page about how language change on the community level looks. So this is just a dummy graph, but in general, language change in the community works like this. If you have date of birth along the x-axis, so the farther you go to the right, the younger the speakers are. And then units of change. So the farther you go up on the graph, the more a person is producing the innovative variant. If you then go out into a community and sample a bunch of speakers and see how far along they are in this change, what you end up with is a plot that looks like this. So this is a dot representing each individual speaker and their date of birth along the x-axis and how far advanced they are in the change along the y-axis. And you can see in general, there's some variation, some scatter. But when you plot this, it falls along a logistic regression line. So this is the famous S-curve of language change. What you will see is that within a single cohort, so like if we look at speakers born in 1925 in this dummy graph, you can see that some speakers are more along the line, more innovative, and then some speakers are more conservative compared to their cohort. But in general, the community as a whole tracks along this S-curve. And in fact, work by Richard Zimmerman shows that the bigger sample you have, the tighter this fit gets, like very, very tight. Okay, so this is what's going on in the background when a language change is happening. This is the variation that young children are experiencing when they're acquiring language. So when that's the situation, what does their sociolinguistic development look like? And we have actually quite a bit of data on what kids' sociolinguistic development looks like. And the first step of this is that young children start out by acquiring whatever their caregiver's production is. So here's a little schema of this. If you have 4 different caregivers, parents, let's say, just as I said above, they're going to be in slightly different places in terms of how innovative they are in this change. And then their kids are going to mimic them. The next step that happens is once they enter a peer group, they can develop cohort norms with each other. So in a US type context, this is typically preschool or kindergarten. Kids come together and all of this variability that they are bringing in because of the variation that they acquired from their parents gets kind of leveled out into a peer cohort norm. The work by Nardi is pretty interesting because it suggests that it's not actually specifically kids talking to each other, but near each other, like next to each other, talking while they're playing. But what ends up at the end of this process is a cohort norm that all of the kids kind of coalesce on. As they go on, and specifically in the pre-adolescent stage, what we find next is that children are calibrating variation in their environment. And what we mean by this is that they're calibrating the direction of change. So Labov and Eckert call this an age vector. What this really means is that kids are aware of the distribution of variance in the environment. So they're aware that their grandparents sound a particular way, and that people slightly younger than them sound a little different, and that their parents sound a little different in the same direction, and that people a little younger than their parents sound different still in the same direction. And that from this information, they can extract an age vector of where they're supposed to go next. Now, it is super important. This is like a really brand new study that just came out. I'm very excited about it. There's evidence that children's ability to calibrate the direction of change is affected by the amount of variability in the input. So this is work by Sophie Holmes Elliott, who was tracking pre-adolescents from the age of 10 to the age of 13 in Southampton, England. And she was looking at a number of ongoing changes in British English. From the vast majority of changes she was looking at, her participants kind of correctly identified where the next step of language change was supposed to be. And between their 10-year-old interview and their 13-year-old interview, went in that right direction, except for TH fronting. What's the deal with TH fronting? In TH fronting, her participants all started in different directions, and some went up, some went down, some stayed the same. When Sophie looked at the rest of the community, so the variation in the environment around them, she found that within an age cohort of like adults and teens, there was just incredibly high variability. So she hypothesizes that this amount of variability makes it difficult to extract the age vector, right? Because the signal to noise ratio is too high. Okay. So the next stage is that during adolescence, and as a result of their calibration, teenagers are going to increment the ongoing changes to the next step of language change, right? So they're going to take the next step. And this cohort of kids who has calibrated will look like this. They'll take the next step in language change. Okay, so that's what it looks like on the community level. For an individual speaker's development plot along their lifespan, or their childhood span, I guess, I'm going to show you a slightly different picture of the same phenomenon. So here we have, again, units of change of a hypothetical change along the y-axis. And here along the x-axis is age. So this is an individual speaker at different stages in their development of sociolinguistic variation. So stage 1 is they're going to acquire parent forms. In my hypothesized kid here, this kid has acquired very conservative forms. Stage 2, they're going to form a peer cohort. So this kid, because their parent was conservative, they get bumped up a little bit in this change. The next stage is calibration. So they're paying attention to the variation in the input and trying to figure out where the next stage is. And then during teenage years, we get incrementation. So they're incrementing this change to whatever the next step in language change should be. And then post-adolescence, we get a period of stabilization, typically. Okay, so this is what we see in the data. Sorry, just moved you guys. And the question is, so, okay, this is what I've just said. Pre-adolescent children calibrate, and teenagers then, because of calibration, can increment onto the next step of language change. But there's this big question of how do we actually get there? How do we get from calibration to incrementation? And here is where ethnographic work on variation can give us some really important cues. So Eckert points out that from the stage of pre-adolescence all the way through adolescence, variation within a cohort, remember the cohort kind of evened out, leveled out the variation. But in pre-adolescence and through adolescence, this variation actually takes on a really important social function. So this works on the level of relatively stable social categories like jocks versus burnouts versus in-betweeners. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with the jocks and burnout study. But the main point, I'm not going to go into all the details here, but the main point is that high schoolers separated themselves into peer groups, social groups that were loosely connected. You can see the majority of the kids in this high school are in-betweeners, but some are burnouts and some are jocks. And your group affiliation, whether you're a burnout or a jock, has an impact on how advanced you are in particular sound changes. So it gets a little complicated because the Northern City shift gets separated into different types of changes that the burnouts are ahead on versus the jocks. But the upshot is the social group that you are a part of predicts how advanced you are in language change. But this also works on a more subtle, not just like these more stable or concrete social categories, but also in stance taking in the moment. So this is work also done by Eckert on pre-adolescence. And Eckert makes a really big point about how in the stage of pre-adolescence, this is when kids are kind of navigating the shift to adolescence. So variation patterns are a little bit more fluid in the pre-adolescent stage, but age takes on a really important role for these speakers. So you get age-based insults. You like the insult crybaby becomes this like very important insult that people don't want to be called a crybaby. And similarly, age-based activities, like it's childish to play in the jungle gym, but it's cool to play wall ball. So your orientation towards being older or being younger starts to really matter in pre-adolescence. So this is a ethnographic study done in a pre-adolescent peer group, where in the community as a whole, there's an ongoing sound change of O fronting. So the older variants, and by this I mean like historically conservative variants, are O, and it's fronting to O. In this group of middle schoolers, they are starting to separate into social cliques. You've got the popular crowd that call themselves the crowd, and then you've got the non-crowd. And the crowd does things like start to assert their independence. They orient towards more teenage activities and make fun of the non-crowd for doing things like watching Barney. So this aligns with orienting towards teenager versus orienting towards child. And this particular speaker, Rachel, Eckert shows that when Rachel is trying to be cute or appeal to an adult's sympathy, her production of the O vowel is farther back in her vowel space. Conversely, in this clip you're about to hear, she's gossiping. She's enacting her social independence more like a teenager. You can hear just how front this vowel is here.
She goes.
She goes, right? So the stance that Rachel is taking in the moment impacts how far along she behaves in this sound change. Okay, so the hypothesis here is that more innovative forms of the ongoing sound changes sound cooler, right? Because teens are doing it, and less innovative forms sound less cool because parents and little kids are doing it. So this leads directly to the hypothesis that teens and preteens are doing incrementation via drawing social indexes from this variation in their environment. Right, so our big hypothesis here is that without access to an entire cohort of peer and near peer speakers, so this is the entire cohort of speakers in your peer group who are differentiating themselves via orienting towards older versus orienting towards younger, and then also like the grade above you and the grade below you. So our hypothesis is that without access to this entire cohort of social indices, calibration is going to be disrupted because the strength of the signal of the age vector is going to dramatically decrease. But also incrementation will be disrupted as the social indexes of variation become less clearly accessible. Okay, so that's sociolinguistic development for kids. But as I said, there's two primary sociolinguistic theories that we think our project will be able to speak to. And the second is language change across the lifespan. So sociolinguistic studies of language variation and change have repeatedly found that most speakers exhibit stabilization starting around the age 20, so right after that adolescent peak. But some studies have also found that speakers continue to change. Some speakers continue to change as they age. And they generally do one of two things. The first is they exhibit retrograde change, where they change in the opposite direction of the community, so they become more conservative. Or they can exhibit what's called lifespan change, which means they're changing in the same direction as the community and becoming more progressive in this change as they age. One of the most famous cases of studying lifespan change is this Harrington and Roybal study of Queen Elizabeth II. So this is a study looking at Queen Elizabeth's Christmas speeches. So every single year, Queen Elizabeth does an annual televised address on Christmas Day. And they looked at her speeches starting from the 1950s all the way through the 1980s. So this is a span of 30 years. So in general, what we see is that the Queen is a super conservative upper class speaker. She kind of becomes this stereotype of hyperstandard. Her variety is referred to as the Queen's English, right? So we might, the idea is that like if we expect anybody to exhibit stabilization after adolescence, it would be the Queen, right? Which is no reason to change. But Harrington and Roybal found significant changes in at least one vowel format for 10 of the 11 vowels that they looked at. And these changes were all consistently in the direction of the community changing norm, right? So in these plots, the S's refer to the community standard. The 8 is what she sounded like in the 1980s, and the 5 is what she sounded like in the 1950s. So if we take a look at like the ash vowel here, you can see, so this is like as in had or cat. You can see that the Queen's pronunciation has changed a ton from up here, sounding more like head, moving down towards the community standard, more close to had, but not quite getting there, right? She's still pretty far behind the community norm. But crucially, she's going in the same direction and doing it after the supposed period of stabilization, right? So something's happening to cause the Queen to change in this direction. So the question is, what is happening? How is she doing this? And there's been a ton of motivations for this type of lifespan change posited. It's a thriving area of research that has a lot more questions than answers. So just pitch for anyone looking for a research project. This is a robust area. But here are some of the motivations that have been suggested. One is linguistic motivations, ranging from level of the grammar to age of the change to variant frequency, right? So whether it's morphology or phonology or phonetics or phonology, or whether it's a new change or close to being complete, or whether it's in the stage period of a vigorous change right in the middle of that S curve. Or does it matter what the token frequency of input is for speakers? Maybe all of these things affect lifespan change. But other possible motivations are cognitive in nature. So things like an individual's brain plasticity, or maybe their personal disposition towards innovation in general, or their levels of memory or attention. And then people have also posited social motivations. So this ranges from things like an individual's degree of contact with younger speakers, which is what Harrington and Roybal posited for the Queen. As the Queen ages, her group of advisors gets younger. relative to her. But also things like the social salience of the change and the upward mobility of the speaker in question. And you can think of a number of other possible social motivations for lifespan change. One of the issues is many of these posited causes of lifespan change are highly correlated, right? So we get variant frequency and social salience interact with the level of the grammar and the age of the change. A person who has a personal disposition that's positive towards innovation, might be open to new experiences and ideas, might also be more likely to spend time with young people. Or maybe the causality is in the other direction. Maybe spending more time with young people turns you into a person who's more open to innovation. So many of these factors are really likely to be correlated in a way that we can't build into the study. But the social distancing imposed by COVID-19 has dramatically impacted one of these factors much more than any of the others, and that's contact with younger people. Okay, which brings us to COVID. As I'm sure you are all aware, COVID has shut down in-person interactions largely across the state of Michigan. So brief timeline, mid-March, Michigan instates a stay-at-home order in response to the growing COVID crisis, which has the effect of closing schools and after-school programs, resulting in a deep disruption to face-to-face contact, face-to-face interaction with an entire cohort of teens. So this idea of entire cohort is really crucial for the research questions that we're asking. So this is going to impact kids who are calibrating language change, teens who are incrementing, and adults who work with teens who we're identifying as the most likely to be exhibiting lifespan change, right? Because they're consistently, in a normal situation, consistently exposed to the most innovative forms of the change. What this means is that social distancing actually creates a natural experiment that allows us to test questions that would otherwise be completely untestable. So questions like, what's the time span of calibration, right? If you have a middle schooler who's socially distancing for a year, is that enough to perturb their calibration of the change in progress? But also, how long-term are any effects that we might see? If it's the case that a year of social distancing messes up kids' ability to calibrate, will they, once they go back in person, will they jump right back to where they were going to be anyway? Or is it a more long-term effect? But also this last question of, is it actually the amount of exposure to teen language or young people's language that results in lifespan change, or is it something else? So all of these questions focus on this big question of how is language change impacted by a disruption to in-person, face-to-face interactions. So now, what is that language change that we're talking about? This is going to be a very brief refresher for many of you. Michigan is part of the northern cities. So here's a map of the northern cities that spans a very wide geographic area. So all the way from Chicago over to Rochester, Buffalo, but crucially spanning most of Michigan. It's a vowel shift that we can go into detail in the question period if you want. In general, it is most advanced in the big cities and less advanced in smaller towns. And the feature that we're going to be specifically focusing on is lot fronting. So this is a traditional part of the northern city shift where the lot vowel, or is moved to the very front of the vowel space. So sounding like this.
Sax.
Sax. So many people who are not familiar with Michigan speech interpret that word as saying sax. But if you play the whole phrase, you can hear what she's saying.
You had to wear socks, no sandals.
Right, you had to wear socks, no sandals. This feature in recent literature has been found to be both salient and stigmatized, and is also recently exhibiting a rapid reversal to the back of the vowel space, so that younger speakers sound a little bit more like this.
Socks.
Socks.
You had to wear socks, no sandals.
Okay, so we have this ongoing rigorous change of lot backing. And so our research question is, how does social distancing impact participation in lot backing? So for kids, does a year of social or more distancing disrupt their calibration? For teens, does it disrupt their incrementation? And for adults who work with teens, does it disrupt their participation in lifespan change? So in order to answer these questions, we need to obtain regular longitudinal data from a number of groups. So kids, especially kids ages 9 to 12, teenagers, especially ages, well, the entire teenage range, and adults. So both adults who work with kids, because those are the ones most expected to be messed up in their lifespan change, but also adults who don't work with kids, because we need a control group to see, is it actually the teenage interaction that's driving this? Okay.
Okay, so thanks to Betsy for giving the broader context and the goals of the project and the questions that we really hope we will be able to answer. But as I'm going to tell you, and as I'm sure you all know, and I certainly spoke to some people today from this community who have had to radically reorient their own research under these new circumstances. It is not easy to answer the research questions you want to answer when you're in a pandemic. But we are trying. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to talk about what we have been attempting to do and how we've been trying to adjust to these circumstances. So how have we been doing fieldwork during a pandemic? Okay, so as I'm sure you all know, sociolinguists usually do their fieldwork face-to-face, and the classic technique is to sit down with someone in their home or another quiet place and just talk to them for an hour while we audio record them. Of course, kids sometimes have to be encouraged to talk through the use of tasks or games, and you can see Betsy doing that there. And many studies incorporate often very long periods of ethnography where the researcher becomes a participant as well as an observer in the community. So here's a page from a student field notebook where they made a sketch of a cafe where they had been talking to members of the speech community they were studying. But obviously the pandemic means that we can't employ any of these techniques, forgetting the long stretches of really casual, but ultimately unself-monitored vernacular speech that we would really want to have. So, let me just come down to my own notes here. All right, so what we can collect is self-recordings, and this is the technique that we have landed on. So self-recordings are not very common in sociolinguistics, because they're just not as rich with the personal connection, and the knowledge of the social context that sociolinguists need to interpret their data. But self-recording data can also yield comparable data to sociolinguistic interviews. So when it comes to style, for example, researchers have found that speakers will exhibit quite wide stylistic variation. Coupland is one of those early avatars of these kinds of studies, and others have confirmed it over the years. With regard to the vernacularity of the speech, in a comparison of reading, lab tasks, sociolinguistic interviews, and self-recordings, Boyd and colleagues determined that self-recordings actually yielded the most vernacular speech and, crucially for us as well, the most advanced productions of ongoing sound changes. But that's not all. Self-recordings in some ways can actually improve upon sociolinguistic interviews in key ways that suit our purposes. So obviously they mitigate the effects of the observer's paradox. There's no interviewer co-present when people are recording themselves. So the effect of a researcher is mitigated. And self-recordings help to address some problems that are specific to longitudinal panel studies. So for example, in some long-running studies, participants get to know their interviewer over the years. And so there is an increasing interviewer familiarity that can have some effect on the speaker's style, right? So there's a confound there. And it makes it hard to disentangle the effects of the speaker's perhaps increasing vernacularity as they become more comfortable with the person interviewing them from actual linguistic lifespan change. So our recordings will be much less likely, we hope, to involve that kind of confound. But self-recordings, all well and good, but ordinary people just don't have these kinds of high-end digital recording devices just lying around at home. And under IRB restrictions, particularly at the very beginning of the pandemic lockdowns, we couldn't even deliver recording devices like this to participants. So we had to obtain self-recordings some other way. Fortunately, of course, what people do have at home is cell phones and tablets and laptops. And nowadays, those devices are actually good enough to produce pretty decent quality recordings. So some anecdotes here, but we think that they're reasonably robust. So test of the iPhone 6, which was a while ago. LeBeau found that the native M4A recordings were as good as the Zoom H4n wave recordings for most sociolinguistic research purposes. And in a pilot analysis of our own recordings, which we'll come to in a moment, we've confirmed that they're certainly good enough for force alignment and for automated measurement of vowel formants, which is what we would need to study something like lot backing. So coming back to our research questions, we recognize that self-recording also lends itself quite nicely to people wanting to do longitudinal repeat recordings. And we were inspired by an earlier self-recording project that was called Mass Observation. This is a UK social science project that was launched in the 1930s. It recruited ordinary people from all over the country to write down their everyday experiences of life in Britain. And the participants mailed their diaries back to the project team on a fairly regular basis. And some diarists participated for decades, some of them just for a few years. Some people came and went. And of course, because this project began in the 1930s, mass observation diaries provide this really fascinating window into the thoughts and experiences of British people as they were going through the Second World War. And down there in the right-hand corner actually is a collection of books in a mass market paperback published a few years ago of edited excerpts from those diaries for a public readership. So we realized that the COVID-19 pandemic was a similar historical inflection point that not only deserved to be documented from lots of everyday angles, but also people might feel very motivated to participate in a self-recording project if they felt that they were invested in documenting this particular historical moment. So our project is designed to be a bit like the Wartime Diaries project, but with sound. So just to give you the project in a nutshell here, our participants are aged 3 and older, and they just audio record their thoughts anonymously, and they submit them to us through our website or our app, which you can see there. And they just talk to us about what they've been up to in the week. They share their thoughts on pandemic life, or they just tell us funny stories. The only requirement is that they be living in Michigan. And so non-native speakers and non-Michiganders are welcome to participate in the project as well, even if their data are not necessarily what we might be analyzing in the first phase of the project. And just as a note, as we go on, you may see references elsewhere in this talk or out there on the internet to this project as the MI COVID Diaries project, which was our original name. But for reasons having to do with the building of this app, we've changed it to MI Diaries. So that's what you'll see throughout. Okay, so to do this project, it turns out you need a lot more people than we've ever really needed to assemble before in our lab, all at once. So here are all the current members of the project team, plus some of our alumni from the team. We're lucky enough to have 3 youth interns at the moment. 2 of them are middle schoolers, and 1 of them is a high schooler. We've got undergraduates majoring in everything from linguistics to advertising, and we've got graduate students from a variety of programs as well, including TESOL, Second Language Studies, and Spanish Linguistics. So why do we have such a big team? I think it's just because we needed to answer our research questions by gathering a lot of data really quickly under very difficult circumstances. It was really critical that we collected recordings from as early in the pandemic as we possibly could. And that meant putting a ton of effort into recruiting participants and processing the incoming data and just keeping every part of the project in motion at once. So we were lucky that we were able to mobilize so many people during a pretty tumultuous period in the spring and early summer, and that so many of them have been able to stick with us for the last few months. So now I'm going to tell you more about how the data collection end actually works and what all of these guys do. Okay, so this is how it looks from the participant end. The participants go to our website to sign up, and if they're a kid, you get to see this wonderful video that Betsy and I made in the summer, and that was IRB approved and gives them all the instructions that they and their parents might need. Once signed up, participants or their parents receive a prompt set through an email, either weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly. They get to choose the frequency. Then they can answer the prompts, all of them, some of them, or just none of them. They can just talk about whatever they like. by recording themselves on the app. And if they submit 15 minutes worth of audio within a 2-week period, they get an Amazon gift card. But we, of course, need our participants to keep doing steps 2, 3, and 4 over and over and over again. So a big part of our project has been concentrated for months now on keeping this project as sticky as possible, trying to keep people engaged. So we need to make them feel like we're listening to them and that we're responding to them and that we're engaging with them. How are we doing that? So besides paying out Amazon gift cards, and as I'll tell you later, coming up with great questions, we've got other ways of giving these guys some buy-in to the project. So our additional methods for this include featuring the participants' own stories on our project website on a regular basis. They have to agree to this, of course, when they sign up with the project, give us permission to do so, and they can opt out of ever being featured if they want. So here's a story from a participant answering a question about playing pranks. And we also have a pretty robust social media presence on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. So a subset of all the faces you saw is the social media team. On the left, you can see a Twitter shout out from the Library of Michigan. So we've partnered with the Library of Michigan, who were independently gathering audio, video, and written documentation of the pandemic right from the very beginning. So participants can also opt to have their anonymized recordings deposited with the Library of Michigan Pandemic Archive starting next year. And finally, we try to put a human face on the project by regularly featuring our own team on our social media, and they provide audio stories as well, so that the participants have a sense of who's at the end of the recordings they're sending in, and get to hear those stories too. So how do we get these folks to actually sit down and record themselves, which is not the most natural thing in the world to do. Maybe it's even less natural than doing a sociolinguistic interview, but people are doing it and they seem to like it. And one reason that we think this has been successful is because we've got an increasingly refined process of prompt development. So we think that really good prompts is what makes these diarists want to come back and want to know what the next batch of questions will look like in the next email. But we keep some questions the same each week. We always ask, what are you grateful for this week? And that was a question that came out very early in the pandemic when we were all feeling pretty down and we were all trying to focus on small things that we could feel gratitude for. But at the same time, we want to acknowledge that things are tough. So we always ask, has anything been particularly difficult this week? And then finally, is there a news headline that has stuck out to you recently? And that allows the diarists to respond to what's going on around them without us necessarily having to guide them. And then at our weekly team meeting, we just brainstorm in subgroups to come up with the rest of the questions each week. And we divide them into batches for kids, teens, and adults. So let me show you some of these questions. Okay, so obviously a lot of our prompts, especially in the spring and the summer, have been about pandemic life in general. So for example, is your workplace opening back up? How do you feel about it? Have your spending habits changed much since the lockdowns started? Is there anything that you're spending more on? More on spending here. There are a lot of things that have been difficult to buy lately because of the high demand. Hand sanitizer, bicycles, the Nintendo Switch. Has there been anything that you wanted to buy but couldn't get a hold of because of the high demand? Okay, but our other questions are more general, and where possible, they're designed to be likelier to elicit personal narratives, which are the exact genre of speech that we hope will be the least monitored. So these examples include, have you ever had a bad roommate or a landlord? What's the favorite Halloween costume that you've ever worn? And this pretty random one that people actually really responded to was, do you like cheese? What's your favorite way to eat it? And then finally, one that's a little bit more obviously engineered to draw out a personal narrative, and that was also popular. Did you ever get stranded anywhere, either as a kid or as an adult? What happened? How did you get home? And some of our prompts come from the diarists themselves. We solicit them quite overtly, and then if we include questions from the diarists, we make sure to feature them very prominently in the weekly emails. So a couple of recent good ones include, what's your favorite picture of you and someone else? What were you doing in it? Where were you? And then, it's been 6 months since the pandemic started. If you were going to make a time capsule of the last 6 months, what would go in it? So we think that using the diarist's own questions gives the diarists some ownership to the project and this sort of deeper sense of engagement with the project. And the diarists actually get excited when we feature their questions, and they sometimes mention it in the recordings that they send us subsequently. So here again is a closer look at these weekly emails. You can see that we always begin with a nod to the featured stories. So what are we featuring this week? Go to the website and see what are the cool stories that we picked out from the previous week. Then you can see the 3 questions there that we always ask, followed by that particular week's batch of questions. Everything from weird neighbors to human interactions, all kinds of things that people are doing in their daily lives. So let's listen to some of these speakers just so that you can get a sense of the humans behind this. So this is an adult story, and there's the transcription. This is an answer to one of our regular questions, the what has been particularly difficult this week.
It's been particularly difficult for me this week. I'll tell you what really, really, really is difficult for me is, you know, I work at I'm an essential employee at an essential business, or deemed essential business. And what really, really gets me going is these people who think that COVID-19 is a joke. They think that it's something to laugh at. They think it's, you know, hilarious. And they don't feel like we have a big red stop sign outside of our door of our store, and it says, you must wear a mask to enter. And we have people that insist that it's their right to enter a private place of business without a mask if they so desire. So what really has been difficult for me this week, I really absolutely hate and despise having to be a gatekeeper for this thing. When I signed up with my employer, I didn't sign up to be a gatekeeper.
And next we've got a story from one of our teenagers talking about Halloween.
I wonder how Halloween's gonna work out. Honestly, personally, if I was a kid or if I had children, I probably would not let them trick or treat, because that's like a whole. I mean, unless you want to go the process of literally getting every single treat, or sanitizing it, making sure that there's nothing on it. But I don't know. I guess how much trouble people want to go to get their children their candies, but I don't know. I mean, it could work, but I don't see it having too much of a turnout.
And finally, one of our most charming recordings from kids, and we have a lot of charming recordings, but we thought this one's particularly resonant.
I think that one of the things that I was thinking about that kind of relates to being at home is that if you think about some Disney princesses like Rapunzel and Elsa and Anna, I really like those Disney princesses, and those Disney princesses had to stay home, for example, because they had to stay home, and Rapunzel was locked in a room for a while. But if there's a song in the movie Tangled, which is "When Will My Life Begin?" and it says all the things she did that day. I think that's a really big inspiration, because if you think about it, there's a lot of things that you can do even at home, and if she could get by, I bet we can too.
Okay, so not only do we have these recordings, but obviously just the picking out of excerpts from the stories takes us another subset of that huge student team that you saw. So the story team work with this customized backend interface of the app that you see here, where the recordings come in. They're marked in the second column from the left there as being recordings that can or can't be shared, right? Yes or no. And then right there in the app, work on the transcription, which is an automated speech-to-text app that we have got integrated here. And so it's easy for them to both quickly listen to the stories, read the stories, and they can correct the transcription right there in the app as well. So the story team have got this down now to a pretty fine art. And then the output, as we've seen on the next slide, is an example of what it then looks like once the story appears on the website. And as you've seen, we try and link them in the weekly email, we push them out to social media, we try and make them really a great public-facing part of the project. Diarists seem to really like it when their stories get featured on the website. And then what we were really aiming for here as well was a sense of communal experience for the diarists themselves. So they don't know each other, we don't know them, they know us a little bit from the team photographs that you saw that we've been putting out on social media. But despite the anonymity, this gives the diarist sense that they're all part of some collective endeavor. And additionally, we've got an archive now of these featured stories on our website going back to April, which is something that casual visitors to the project website can browse through and might inspire them then to sign up and become diarists themselves. Okay, so to wrap up and conclude what we've got here from the preliminary stages of our project, as Betsy said earlier, we think that the COVID-19 pandemic, for all of its obvious disadvantages and downsides, is actually providing sociolinguists with this unusual natural experiment. So without having to do something really wildly evil or unethical, we can actually ask, what are the sociolinguistic consequences of cutting off face-to-face interaction for people with an entire generational cohort? We're not really going to try to answer this question until next year, when we think we'll have sufficient data for some initial analysis. As I hope I've conveyed, just the data collection and processing and the engagement with participants alone is taking all of our time at the moment. And the other thing that we want to be doing in the next year, before we get to the serious data analysis, is talking to other researchers, including all of you, about the best practices for this kind of work, so that we can get better at it and so we can learn from other people who are doing similar things. And we're expecting to discover more benefits and more challenges of self-recordings for sociolinguistic analysis. We've certainly learned a lot just in a practical way about how to ramp up a project in basically no time. Betsy, I think the ink had barely even dried on her contract when we started this project, and the pandemic had just begun. And of course, we're continually responding to conditions that are changing as we're recording these diaries. We've learned that longitudinal projects on this scale require not just lots of people, but lots of different kinds of expertise. And we have to think about things that we might not normally have thought about too much when we've been doing sociolinguistic research before. So for example, we're currently thinking about this project in terms of a public brand. So how do we want to position this brand in the public space? How do we want to protect our brand? What are the values of the project that we want to be putting forward as a brand? And how do we ensure that we keep the trust of our diarists as we're doing that? So what's next? Remember that we want a picture of how social distancing affects language over the course of the whole pandemic, if possible. So although we're mainly tracking participants that we have had since the beginning of the pandemic lockdowns, we want to continue recruiting new participants. And obviously this will turn out, we hope, to be a valuable corpus more generally of Michigan speech. So we're just going to keep collecting data while we have this operation underway. Just to tell you a little bit about what we're doing with recruiting so far for participants, we have been utilizing the press as much as we can, both internal at MSU through the College of Arts and Letters, through a newsletter that MSU puts out through MSU Today that goes to thousands of people across the state. We've been on public radio, we've been in local publications like the Lansing City Pulse. We've got community partners, as I mentioned, not just the Library of Michigan, but also 4-H, a middle school in Plymouth. What we found to be really effective already, actually, is just making use of our own personal social networks. And we've been doing this in relatively automated ways, just by sharing recruitment brochures like the one you see there on the right, through Facebook and other social media. But our student team have also been very intentional about targeting former sports coaches or their current middle school teachers or whatever it happens to be, and asking them to join the project and to spread the word. We've been identifying and contacting youth-oriented organizations like the YMCA and Boys and Girls Club, and also businesses. Good old-fashioned email listservs have actually been amazingly helpful. We recruited a load of people just by writing to an MSU family-oriented listserv, as are parent Facebook groups and Facebook groups for specific neighborhoods and for cities in Michigan. But we would love to hear anything else that you might have to suggest to us about how we can continue to recruit participants from across the entire state and in the most sort of socially diverse way that we possibly can. So I will wrap up there, and we're ready for your comments and questions. Thank you very much for inviting Betsy and I to talk today.
Thank you, Betsy and Suzanne. So it's now open for Q&A, and as I've said, we will do this in one of two ways. You can use the raise your hand function, or you can type a question in the Q&A if you don't want to ask the question yourself directly. And I will begin. I see there's immediately a question that was typed into the Q&A saying, from an anonymous attendee, saying, this is a really interesting project. I wonder if I can join your team.
Yes. Yes, send us an email, absolutely.
Okay, that's an easy.
We've got so many people, we have room for more, for sure.
Okay, Robin Queen, I saw had her hand up. Robin.
Hey, thanks, Suzanne and Betsy. It's great to see you virtually and hear about this really great project. I actually had two questions for you. So one is about this notion of brand. And I was curious how you're thinking about that and kind of the choice to frame it in terms of being branding. And then my other question is a little bit about self-recordings. I've used self-recordings to get shepherds whistles. So had shepherds record themselves while they were whistling, and also found them a really great way of getting good data that was quite analyzable. So all I needed to look at was the fundamental. And so it's exciting to see the ways in which you were able to use self-recordings in such a robust way. I was curious if you're also collecting the data that you're getting on your social media presence. So presumably people are also interacting with you there. And if that's something that you're capturing and planning to do some analysis of, especially I could imagine Twitter could, I mean, I don't know. I mean, depending on the kinds of comments you get, I mean, if it's mostly people reacting in a feel-good way, I mean, that's a kind of interesting thing. But if people are also pushing back at you or any of that kind of thing, that could also be an interesting thing to analyze. So I was just curious about the social media piece of it. Thanks.
So the social media piece is easier. I'm going to quick answer that. And then I think, Suzanne, the branding question is for you. At the beginning of the project, we had a couple incidences of people responding to our Facebook posts. I think it is in particular because we had just shared a featured story of a participant whose wedding had to get replanned. So it was a feel-good story about like, here's what we did instead, and we still managed to have like a really nice time. But we got a couple of comments on our Facebook post for that was like asserting that COVID was a hoax and things like this. So that's when we got together and decided to actually come up with a social media policy, which we should have done beforehand. We discovered that basically we were going to delete any comments that were anti-science or any comments that were negative towards any of our participants. But I think since then, it's mostly been just kind of positive reshares. We are not getting a ton of actual engagement, like comments. The big exception for that is when we share the team stories, And then that team member often shares it to their social media, and then their family and friends comment and, you know, feel happy.
Yeah, one thing I would add to that is we just secured some undergraduate research grants for this academic year. And we tasked two of the undergraduate researchers with looking at the relationship between our social media posts and diary submissions and participant signups. Oh. Because, you know, we're doing all this social media stuff, but what we don't know, but we've now got enough data to look at, is what actually helps the project in tangible ways. So that's something we should know by the spring. The brand question. So I think this came about because the project is the stable presence here, right? It's the thing that the diarists are engaging with. And like anyone or any entity that has a public presence, and particularly on social media, I think you want that that presence to be consistent, first of all. And because this is a longitudinal project, it's also got to be sort of consistent over time. So we've already changed the name of the project, and we're trying to manage that rebranding, I guess. And we've had for a while, because we were doing all of this so quickly, right? We had different logos, one on the website, one on the Twitter account, a different one somewhere else. So we wanted it obviously to look like a legitimate project. And so sort of consolidating those things was important. So this is just about general looking professional. But the presence in our team of students who work in experience architecture, so designing the experience of the user as they navigate things like websites, and from advertising, made us think that we needed that kind of thinking about this project, and that if we were going to be trusted, and if we were going to keep participants feeling reassured, but also happy, feeling like we were a positive presence, that we might need to learn something from how people plan and manage brands. And of course, brands are not necessarily commercial, right? NGOs, nonprofits, universities are also brands. So we need to learn a little bit more about how to do this over the long haul. And actually just yesterday, we had a discussion about the values of the brand, right? What are the values of the project? One of them was we are pro-science, but we got the team to brainstorm what they thought were key parts of the brand identity, and trust came through a lot. I think in the end, one of the things that we thought about was, now Betsy, you have to remind me here, it was a really nice phrase, like the brand is about having our diarists trust us with their authentic selves. Because what we also think happens when people are self-recording, and particularly at this time, is that they're bearing their souls sometimes in a way that they might not. Not to mention we're featuring some of their audio excerpts on a website. And so it's important that the project both reflect authentic experiences and authentic people, but that we can be trusted with that authenticity. So we're just beginning this thinking, but I'm curious to branch out in this more interdisciplinary way to think about how we do it.
Thank you. So I will go to a question in the Q&A that comes from Dominique Canning that says, do you see an even distribution of participants across the state, or are they concentrated in specific areas? Do you want it to be representative? What's your thinking there?
Yeah, so we would like it to be representative as possible. We find, because so much of our successful recruitment techniques have been through personal social networks, we do find a very strong concentration like around the Lansing area. But part of the reason that we were also reaching out to things like city Facebook pages, for instance, is that we noticed, okay, we're missing an entire swath of the north of the mitten, like here up. So I got on Facebook and like joined all of these city Facebook pages and said, hey, we're doing this project. We'd love to hear from more people in the north of the state. So that drew some new participants, but we do see it concentrated around the places where us and our team members have personal social networks. So I guess actually relatedly, if any of you want to share the project with your social networks too, that would be deeply helpful to us because that's going to reach a really different audience. Another kind of upshot of, so we're interested in collecting data from a diverse range of Michiganders, both geographic, age-wise, socioeconomic status, ethnicity. And we do find that our participants skew white and skew female. So this is actually kind of maybe an open question to y'all. So we've been doing a couple of different things to try to ramp up recruitment in demographics that we're missing with mixed success. So this is also like, if any of you have ideas for how we can get into non-white women, that would be awesome.
Thank you. I think let's go to Savi Nambudiripat. Savi.
Hi, thank you. It's so exciting to hear this huge, ambitious project. We have so much. I can't believe how quickly you put all of this together. It's so exciting to see all of that, and I can't wait to read about like the methods, findings that you come up with as well. So one thing, I don't know if I missed it, but how many? I know that your participants, like the number is varying because you have some people that have been doing it consistently, and people are dropping in and out. But can you give like a range of how many participants there are, and also how? I'm curious about like how many of them are like willing to make their stuff public, and like are they doing it week by week? Yeah, so I'm just curious about like how that's happening. Yeah.
So we just this morning crossed our 300th participant threshold.
Wow.
So we have about 304 participants. Of the people who have signed up, we don't actually have a recording of all of the people that signed up. So it's around 70 to 80% of that 300 who have submitted one recording. Most people who submit one recording continue to submit. We see, okay, so because people can sign up to receive emails weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly, our monthly emails go out to the biggest range of participants. So the monthly emails, that's when we get the biggest influx. But in general, what we're getting is, I would say, probably 10 to 20 per week. So that varies. So some people are 10 to 20 individual participants. So then within that range, some are bi-weekly, some are monthly, some are weekly. We have a couple participants who submit recordings like daily, which is great for us. So they actually is where we get a lot of our diarist questions, because of course daily we only send out like 15 questions a week. So they're coming up with additional things to ask. But yeah, from this like big range of participants, we're getting probably 20 regular contributors when you look at like the monthly range. The other thing is, so they can sign up, when participants sign up, they can choose whether or not they want to have their stories featured. The vast majority say yes. They also can choose whether they want their stories sent to the Library of Michigan afterwards. Again, the vast majority say yes. And then we also have an option for if they want to opt out of payment. This was done for two reasons. One, because we heard some feedback from participants that they didn't want to take our money, which is great for us because linguistics budgets are not big. So we implement this as like, if you want to opt out of payment and use your $5 to pay another participant, that would be great. And that skews by age. So like a $5 gift card every 2 weeks is a really good recruitment tool for middle schoolers, right? Because they can't get a job otherwise. It's like the one way that they're going to get cash. But yeah, you didn't ask about this, but I'm talking about it.
Actually,
but we wanted to.
That, so thank you, because I was like, how are you paying all these people? And how's that going? That's really, really cool. Yeah.
Actually, though, I will add that one reason we're paying them in Amazon gift cards is that we learned early on when we were trying to build this out of nothing, that it's strangely hard at Michigan State University to just pay people money unless it's physical cash. And what we would really have liked to do is pay people money, but we couldn't. And so we're opting for gift cards, and we were sort of limited in what we could give as gift cards there as well. So if anybody here knows of magical means by which we might be able to suggest to MSU that they adopt a new practice, please tell us about it, because we think that, for example, we have kid participants who would really like to be able to buy virtual things for the video games that they play. And an Amazon gift card is not particularly useful for that unless they're going to trade it with a parent. So giving them actual money would be very helpful, but that hasn't been possible for very frustrating reasons.
Thank you. I unfortunately don't have anything to add to that because it's the same deal at Michigan as far as I can tell. So yeah.
Thank you, Savi. So, we have more than enough time if other people want to raise their hands or pose a question while we wait for other people. Dominique's question about the representativeness of your participants made me think about a specific sub-community. And you've said that you include anybody who lives in Michigan, even if they're immigrants. So I often recruit, I often run studies in South Africa, but I want to pilot them before I fly there. So I recruit participants through a Facebook group for South Africans living in Michigan. And I think those immigrant groups could be, I know it adds a whole level of additional complication, but they are so sensitive to and conscious of language in a way that I think native speakers of English who've lived their whole lives in Michigan are not, right? So if I just see the things that's discussed on that Facebook page, they constantly comment on Michigan English and how it is strange and how difficult it is to understand Michiganders. So there's a level of awareness of language that I think immigrant communities have that native local Michiganders might not have. But then I don't know how complicated it will be to try and factor in the whole mess of the complicated background that immigrants contribute.
Well, so I think that's a very good suggestion. For the research question that we posed here as being like the thing that we're looking at, I think you're right that it would just be like another level of analysis to disentangle that. But one thing that we are really aware of as we're building this corpus is that like there are going to be research questions that we haven't thought of yet that people would like to use this corpus to answer. And I think getting data from immigrant communities is a really rich area of research that I would love for other people, students, ourselves, whoever, to be able to do that. So yeah, I think immigrant communities, especially because of the meta-linguistic commentary, I think you're right that there's a lot of very interesting ground there too.
Savi just posted a follow-up in the Q&A saying that she wants to second my point about diaspora communities, so maybe there's enough interest there. But then she also asks, she's curious whether you're getting information about whether and how the participants are social distancing. And I assume that might be relevant to, if they don't social distance, they might still have interaction that might therefore inform their their sociolinguistic awareness and development.
So we have, when they sign up, we ask them who they are living with, who's in the household, on the assumption that if they are very strictly social distancing, those are the only people that they have interaction with. And if they're not, those are the people they're mostly having interactions with. But of course, between the time they signed up and now, that might have changed. And we're aware that the degree to which they social distance may also be fluctuating week to week or month to month, not just because the Michigan rules are changing, but also because people's sense of what they can tolerate or what they've normalized changes as well. So I think short of deliberately tracking that in an extremely detailed, temporally granular way, there isn't a good way for us to do this, other than say, no matter how much or little folks in the project are social distancing, it's certainly a lot more than they would have been doing normally. So as long as it's relative to normal, which it surely cannot be at the moment, that's good enough for us. And the other practical constraint there is we would like people to continue sending us diaries. So we've also been having discussions about whether and when to give our diarists additional things to do. Is it okay to survey them intermittently? Because we also don't want to put them off. So we have to be quite careful there. So that, I think, is what I would say to the, how much are they social distancing? We don't know, we just know it's much, much more than normal. But you also asked about other kinds of interactions that they're having. So I'll let Betsy answer that one.
Yeah, I just want to also jump on the question of like, how do we know how much they're social distancing? There's one piece of information that we do have, which is where they're living. So we're not tracking it in real time right now, but it will not be difficult, especially for the kids, to track whether their school districts are in-person school or not in-person school, which brings us back to like the main thing that we think matters is not actually face-to-face interaction with nobody, but rather in-person interaction with like this entire cohort so that they can access the age vector and the social indices of variation. So like, for instance, we know that a lot of our participants are in like pandemic pods where they will actually see some of their friends regularly, or they'll play video games online with their friends and be talking to them. But I think for the hypotheses as we are positing them, interacting with your own clique, your own social group, we expect won't be enough to allow kids to do this like very large scale calibration.
So basically we're assuming that jocks are not playing video games with burnouts, pretty much.
Yeah, yeah. The other thing is we do periodically ask things like, is your school going back to person? Is your school online? And so this week, one of the questions we asked was, have you gotten to see any of your friends in person recently? What did you do? How often do you see them? So we get some data like this, but as Suzanne said, it's not in a like robust social science survey type of a way, because we want to keep participants engaged and not feeling like we're big brothering them.
Thank you. So here's another question in the Q&A from Kelly Wright. And she asks, so you say that the interviews are anonymized, the diaries, but what kinds of metadata are you gathering? And you know, how does that impact the anonymization? And I was also wondering if people mention their names or other identifiable information, whether that is, you know, covered in white noise or cut out. And then Kelly's question is actually a second part question asking, how would you know if somebody is an immigrant if they don't self-disclose that, for instance, in a diary entry? So a two-part question.
Thanks, Kelly. So for the anonymization, we say to participants, please start every diary entry with your name and today's date. So it's not anonymized, it's not anonymous on our end, it's confidential. This is partially so that if anything gets messed up with like the file name, we still will be able to connect the recording to the speaker and to when they recorded it. Because since longitudinal data is part of the research project, we need to know when they've submitted each recording. As to metadata, what we have is when they sign up, there are a few required fields, their email, whether or not they agree to participate, and I think, and their name. That's it. Everything else that we collect from them at sign up is optional. That being said, so things like who are you living with at home right now, and your age, your ethnicity, where are you from? Almost everybody answers all of those questions. On the first, when they sign up and then we add them to our database, they get a welcome email saying, thank you so much for signing up. Here's how to do your first audio recording. Here are the questions that we ask. And the questions are, where did you grow up? Where do you live now? And then some questions like, was there a moment that you realized this was going to be an actual big deal, the pandemic? And a couple of other demographic questions. So I think, yeah.
I was just thinking about Kelly's question, and I'm pretty sure we ask about native language or home language, right? So that might be the only way we could get at the question. We won't know for sure if someone is an immigrant necessarily, but we can at least determine whether they are a native speaker of US English, I guess. Is that right?
Yeah, we ask what languages do you speak at home? But yeah.
I made you lose your train of thought, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. As far as other metadata, that's it, I think. Basic demographic questions at the beginning when they sign up, and then things that they tell us in their diary recordings. I mean, the other piece of this is like, people are telling us about their lives. So there's a lot of additional data that we can obtain and qualitatively through their recordings. But we don't ask, are you an immigrant? Or do you speak Michigan English or something like that?
Well, the question of whether you're an immigrant might be difficult to get past the IRB, and is anyway probably not a question one would want to ask at the moment. Okay, so another question in the Q&A from Dom Buavicit. He says, on the note of additional tasks, I'm wondering if whether you are interested in having your participants do any perceptual tasks. I could imagine that the app would be a really powerful tool for soliciting very straightforward and quick forced choice and or rating tasks. And then kind of connecting to that, I mean, the other similar project that I'm familiar with, although it's pre-pandemic, is a large similar project that Frans Hinskens did in the Netherlands, where they had a cell phone app and they collected both production and perception data from tens of thousands of Dutch speakers. So yeah, you know, echoing Dom, I could imagine adding on to the existing app other types of functions.
I'm just looking at our expressions, like Betsy's all over this and I'm looking skeptical. So maybe we should give our dueling perspectives on this.
But I was just going to say that app actually is one of the things when we did a number of things to try to collect data. One of the reasons we landed on we need an app is because we were trying to collect data from kids. And when we were using a web browser, it's just literally opening up a web browser, you lose a lot of participants who are kids because they don't want to do that. That's not part of their like normal routine. So I was trying to pitch this to the like Michigan State iOS design group, why we need an app. And they said, this kind of app is not possible. And the app you just mentioned, Andres, is what I brought to them to be like, it's possible. This type of app can exist. What we have right now is like, we have this massive project. As Suzanne said, it's big and robust, and it can feel oftentimes like we're kind of like sprinting and out of breath to every next stage. And I will say the app is an example of that. Like we didn't have a budget at the time. And so we hired a student programmer to create like the bare bones app, what we would need, like access to the microphone and then uploading to our database. And it works fine. But the next thing I'm gonna say is the iOS Design Lab teaches a class every semester where the students take on clients and like basically practice interacting with clients and figuring out what they need and how to suggest design things and then build an app. And we were invited to be one of the clients, and I just spoke to them for the first time this week, actually, on Tuesday. So that's a really amazing idea, and I will bring it to the app designers to see. I don't know if it's something we want to add in right now, but if it's a thing that could be easily implemented down the road, it's a really cool idea. Suzanne, give us the other.
No, I agree. It's a really cool idea. I'm going to say two things. One is I just bring it back to the precious resource that is our diarists and the fact that this is a longitudinal project. And so they're not a participant pool in the usual sense, right? They didn't sign up to be given lots of different tasks. And that's not necessarily the thing that will keep, or at least we don't know if that's one of the things that will keep them motivated to carry on sending us diaries. And if it's not, we might lose these precious resources. So that would be a very big gamble. On the other hand, Betsy has started to sneak some questions into our weekly prompts that are what sociolinguists call semantic differential tests. So they're designed to get the speaker to produce specific lexical items that contain a vowel of interest. And we do it by asking people about near synonyms like hat and cap. And do you think they're the same thing? I think if we had a perceptual task that could be done in an extremely low radar way, that wouldn't disrupt the vernacularity of the speech, or the vernacularity of the project, maybe I should say, then yeah, I absolutely think that would be of value, because you're completely right. We're getting production and not perception. And some of the questions so far have been about awareness of Michigan speech, for example, and we haven't got very much of that data in general in our lab. So it would be great to get more. The rollout of it, though, I think would have to be consonant. I'll just say this, with our brand values. That's something we'd have to think about.
Thank you very much. So I think we're going to end here because we're already at 5:30. And since I'm the moderator, I get the last word. I think the one thing that I really appreciate about your project, and that resonates with me with the project that I've been a member of, and I so wish that my colleagues Nick Hendrickson and Lorenzo Garcia Amaya were here, because they really ran that project. It's also a big project where we were documenting a community of bilingual speakers in Patagonia, Argentina. But what is similar to your project is the very large team with our undergraduate research assistants from computer science and Spanish and linguistics and psychology. And it is exactly that diverse team that got us to think about things like branding, like building an archive and how to do that. And so the things that we as linguists don't think about and don't have the skills to do. And I think this means that we need to think about how we do training for our own graduate students. We need to introduce team management skills, and we need to introduce concepts like branding. It needs to be it's becoming part of how research works. So congratulations on that. Please write the curriculum that we can use to expose students to these ideas.
See if we can fit it in between all the brand values discussions that we're having.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much. So it is now exactly 6:30. I am posting in the chat function again the link to our Zoom meeting. So let's all meet back. I hope many of us can make it in 15 minutes at 6:45. And then we will just hang out for a little bit, more opportunity to talk to Suzanne and Betsy, whether about this work or just in general. So thank you again to our speakers. It was a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.